This episode is made possible by our generous patrons. To learn more, visit patreon.com/ink2film.
Welcome to the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book
and then see the movie.
I'm James.
And I'm Luke.
And this week, with the help of special guest Fonda Lee, we discuss Francis Ford Coppola's 1974 film, The Godfather Part 2.
We'd like to welcome back award-winning author Fonda Lee.
It's good to be back.
I'm so excited to talk about Godfather Part 2. It's my first time seeing it, and it was really something.
So what were your impressions having not seen it before? I've seen it multiple times, so I'm curious as to what your initial reactions were.
Very positive. It was a very good movie, but very different. But I don't know, it was different and similar, and I definitely have a lot to say about it. I do want to call out, James, you are playing hurt with us today. You just had your wisdom teeth out, so you're going to probably be talking a little bit less than usual, but, thanks for powering through it.
Yeah, I'm still here. I'm bringing the info. I did a lot of research for Part 2 as well. And I'm excited. I'm glad to hear that you enjoyed it, Luke, because I know that you enjoyed the first one, but you said that it was a little under your expectations because they were so massive. So I'll be interested to hear that from you, and it's great to have you back, Fonda. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, Godfather Part 2 is, I think I said this last week, one of the few sequels out there that not just lives up to, but in many ways surpasses the first movie. And I think it's one of the few sequels, I think Lord of the Rings was the other one, that actually won the Academy Award for Best Picture. So being right now actually in the midst of writing second book of a trilogy, I can really appreciate the enormity of the task that Coppola had in front of him when the studio was like, follow up this insane hit with like something that's going to live up to it.
And I do have to say, speaking of this being a great story, we did finish your story as well. Luke and I finished reading Jade City, and we're definitely going to talk about that. And I just wanted to say, from the perspective of somebody who's doing the podcast with you, what a fantastic piece of work. Like it was so much fun to read, and like really just like I can totally see where you were coming from with how it's kind of homage while also entirely being its own thing, and it was really cool.
Oh, thanks. That's very much what I wanted to accomplish. And I'm curious about how you guys experienced it, because we were doing the Godfather book and the movies at the same time. And usually, people aren't going to be reading my book with that direct of a comparison. And obviously, there's so many other influences that went into the book. But I imagine that certain things would have popped because we were doing it this way.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what happened for me. It was like things were leaping out, and I was going, "Oh, this is kind of like this," and I could see maybe this was in your mind when you were writing this, and it was funny because I was like, "Yeah, I would never have noticed that if I wasn't watching the movie while I'm reading it, and just steeped in both of those, because like my head's swimming with all these gangsters right now, which is awesome. It's super fun, but it was." Doing those two things in concert, I wonder if hopefully some of our listeners did the same thing, honestly, because it would be interesting to know if people had any similar reactions to that. So let us know if you do.
And and if you haven't, definitely check it out. I highly endorse it.
Yeah, if you like The Godfather and you like fantasy and sci-fi and all that stuff, like if those two things overlap for you, you should absolutely be reading this book.
I'm also hoping that even people who aren't into mafia films or aren't familiar with The Godfather we'll check it out, because I think we've mentioned this before, that one of the things that The Godfather succeeds in doing is kind of breaking out of the tropes and the the cliches of the mobster movie, the mafia movie, and being really more of a family saga and about the relationships between these members of the family. And I think you see this a lot in The Godfather Part 2. It's something that I tried to put a lot into my book and sort of make it much more about the family drama. And I think Godfather Part 2 succeeds on a level even greater than Godfather Part 1, largely because it becomes intergenerational in a way that is even more pronounced. And if Godfather Part 1 had that sort of succession story of Vito passing the torch on to Michael, here you really see kind of the bookends of the Corleone family. You see like the rise of Vito as a young man, and you see really the struggles and I think the beginning of the fall of Michael. And that, the way that has framed the movie, the way that the movie is structured, creates that contrast throughout in a way that like it just gives this movie an epic scope that you don't see in pretty much like any other gangster film or in most other films of this genre.
The way that the present story and the flashback so perfectly line up kind of lend it to this, everything's drawing parallels to each other, but it's like we'll see stuff going on with Fredo, and then we see like young Fredo being born, something like that. And it's just like the way that like you said, like I feel like Vito is building this family and building this empire, and then Michael has this empire and he's losing family, and like realizing how important it is, but just it's not working out for him. Like the family is failing him, or he's failing the family.
Yeah, I think structurally, I was also thinking about the story, and it's not an easy one to kind of map out in my head. Like, how is the structure of this story? Because you do have two parallel stories, each with their own structure. I don't know if you could call it 3-act for the flashback, because it really isn't, because it sort of leads to, it almost is, but then it has that final flashback, which is more in the future and has a different kind of note to it. And then, I don't know, this is getting like story nerdy, but like, is that a denouement for the prologue part or the prequel part? And then the modern, the more further in time part of the story, I don't know, contemporary storyline, I guess I would call that, even though it's not. That one also is kind of not really a 3-act structure. It feels more sprawling than that. So it's interesting. Did you think about the structure of this movie at all? These series of movies at all when you were thinking about Jade City?
I did not really. I mean, I really thought of The Godfather Part 2 as two intersecting stories. And I saw it almost like as a, if you can imagine sort of a graph with like, the story of the family rising in one plot line and falling in the other. And so there's this sort of balance to the story of a rising arc in one area and a falling arc in the other area that creates that kind of fascinating juxtaposition throughout. I don't think it's one of those movies that I would try to ever break down into like hero's journey or 3-act system at all. But it works, and I think it works incredibly well. And I'd read somewhere that initially there were more cuts, there were more breaks between the past and the present in terms of flashing back and forth. And in editing, they decided to make each of the pieces longer. So you follow Michael Corleone and his storyline for longer before you go back to Vito. And so you get to stay with those characters a little bit longer, which I think makes sense, because the risk that any filmmaker would run into trying to pull off this kind of structure would be fragmenting the audience's attention. And it could have happened here. And certainly as a writer, I'm very aware of the fact that every time I do a flashback, I'm asking the reader to break their attention. And it's a place where someone could stop reading and be like, okay, well, this is a break. I'm going to put the book down. So to maintain momentum throughout multiple flashing back and flashing forward instances is tricky. And it's done well here because it doesn't happen all that often. You do get to stay with the characters for good long chunks of time. And when there is a transition, it's done very well thematically. So like James mentioned, there's these, it leaves at points where you want to come back to those characters. I think one that pops to mind for me, is after Fredo gets the phone call and you realize that he's the traitor in the family. Mm-hmm. And so you really, you know that this is going to come to a head in the present day storyline, but that's when the film shifts and you see young Fredo. I think he's crying because he has pneumonia, and you see like Vito's worry for him, and so you're immediately invested because the same characters are in both timelines, and the contrast between them in those two different timelines is really fascinating.
So I think another reason that it works so well, and I agree with all that, is also just the presence of Vito Corleone in this story, in his absence from the further timeline, that I think like he was such a big figure in that first movie, and I missed him. Like I missed Marlon Brando, I missed having him on screen, and so I was really glad that we got this extended look at his life before. And Robert De Niro obviously comes in and plays this iconic character, and felt a little different, but also I could tell it was supposed to be the same person, so that was good. But it's so hard because you're Marlon Brando was such a presence. I don't know, it was interesting. But before we get away from it, just because I was thinking when you mentioned Hero's Journey, I started thinking, and I think Vito's story actually is a sort of Campbellian hero's journey, because he leaves Sicily to a strange land, grows, changes, learns, becomes a new person, and then returns home to mete out vengeance. And that return home is such an essential part of that hero's journey, right? Return home having changed. And so it's interesting because kind of nestled within this other story, there is sort of this rise to power hero's journey going on with Vito. And I honestly didn't even think about that until you said it. And then I was like, could it fit? And then I kind of made it fit in my mind. So I don't know. What do you think?
No, it's a good point. I think you're right. I think you could also view Michael in the first Godfather movie in that sense, right? He's like the prodigal son who leaves, and he gets called back and returns, if you will. So he is a much more heroic character in the first movie. The second movie goes beyond kind of the typical place where you sort of end the hero's journey triumphant, if you will, and sort of shows all the consequences that Michael has to deal with as a result of taking on this mantle.
I like that. It's the sins of the father being passed on to him too, in some ways, that it seems like, this story really plays out multi-generational. And we saw that Vito had this sort of happy end to his life, but maybe that's because he passed so much of his burden of what he's been doing onto his son, who now has to deal with it. And I felt like Michael was almost the villain of this story. I found him far less sympathetic than he was in the first movie, and he far more cold-blooded. And the way he is sort of dismantling everything in his life is really pretty striking. I know we're getting way ahead in the plot. I don't know how chronologically we want to go in this movie, but I don't know. Hopping around is also, I think, gives you an ability to talk about the story as a whole in a way that when you're just in a scene, you can't.
Yeah. So, I mean, we talked a lot about Coppola last week, and just the fact that he followed up that very successful film, The Godfather, 2 years later with The Godfather Part 2. And like Fonda says, it's just so close and so equal in terms of how successful it is and how much it works for me personally. Something I did want to mention is some of those things that you touched on really quickly. So De Niro, you said that you felt like it was different, but did it end up working for you? Did you like that he was like speaking in a Sicilian dialect most of the movie? Did that maybe, if he was speaking English, would that have worked better for you?
No, it wasn't that. I think it was just whenever I see this happens all the time on TV and stuff. It just takes a moment when there's an adult actor playing another adult actor. There's a certain benefit of the doubt I'm willing to give, like when we have to cast a child to play an adult, like a younger version of an adult. Like I get it, they're not going to look that similar. But, like, as close as they made Robert De Niro look, like, he doesn't look the same as Marlon Brando. It looks like a different person, and you have to like, take a leap of, like, okay, this is a young Vito, get over it. Now I'm okay. And so once I was able to get over it, then I was fine.
I think it's funny because I think I've just adjusted to it, like, to the point that I think that he totally looks just like him, and I'm like, wow, it's like, for whatever reason, it really works for me. Brando and De Niro both won Oscars for this role, so they're the only two actors in history to win an Oscar playing the same role.
Oh, same character.
I feel like same. I felt like it was kind of interesting because Brando won for Best Actor and De Niro won for Best Supporting Actor.
Fonda, how do you find De Niro's portrayal?
I am with James in that it's just so baked into my understanding of those characters now that I just accept it. And I think De Niro did a really, I mean, clearly he's different person than Brando, but I think he did a really admirable job with the mannerisms and the presence of Vito Corleone that I bought it very quickly. And and De Niro obviously is a fantastic actor, and just like the way that he talks, the sort of small gestures that he has in the movie, I could see that he clearly kind of channeled Vito Corleone as a younger person, I can totally see why both their performances would be Oscar worthy. I think Al Pacino was up for an Oscar as well.
I believe so.
For multiple times over the course of the Godfather saga, never won, and so kind of was belatedly awarded Best Actor for Scent of a Woman, which is always somewhat amusing to me because that was like I don't think of that as the defining role of Al Pacino, and it's like the Academy voters were like, yeah, we have to rectify this wrong, so you get this Oscar for this.
It seems like that happens a lot. It seems like we can go back and find a lot of actors who deserved it for a certain role and then get a hand me later on, even though they're great roles. Something interesting about talking about actors and Coppola having to bring all these people back is a lot of the actors really wanted a payout for this movie. So a funny one is Sonny. Sonny is only in one scene in this movie, and he demanded that he was paid the same amount that he was paid for Godfather 1. And he eventually got paid that amount of money. So he got the same amount of money for part 1 and 2.
It doesn't work out all the time, though. I believe there was some sort of dispute, monetary and otherwise, with the actor of Peter Clemenza. Castellano, I think his name was. The negotiations didn't work out. And so Clemenza is not back in Godfather Part 2. And originally, the role that is in this movie played by Frank Pentangeli was written for Peter Clemenza. And so they had to adjust it by basically making the character of Pentangeli be like an associate of Clemenza rather than Clemenza himself. So that was a adjustment due to actor hiring issues that affected the story. And even though I know we're not covering Godfather Part 3, that is the huge one where Tom Hagen is missing from Godfather Part 3 because they couldn't hammer out an acceptable pay rate for Robert Duvall, which is just a travesty because the fact that Hagen is missing from Godfather Part 3 in my mind is half the reason for why that film doesn't live up. I mean, there's multiple things that you can go into with Godfather Part 3, and it's not a bad movie, but God, Hagen not being there.
And he was so great in this movie too again, and Robert Duvall killed it with that role. I would have paid him whatever he wanted for Part 3.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, why did you make Godfather Part 3 if you couldn't have Tom Hagen?
Yeah. Clemenza, I'm bummed to hear that because I love the idea of him being playing that function in this story because it unifies the prologue stuff to the contemporary stuff so much better. That I'm very frustrated now that didn't happen because I think this movie's great, but that would have been an even better thing to have in this movie. That's frustrating. Damn it.
I agree.
Actors.
Yeah.
I know you want your money, but somebody just make it happen. Negotiate it, or studios pay them more, whatever. Just make it happen. That's frustrating.
That is one good thing about being an author is I don't have to deal with live humans. I can do whatever I want with the characters, the book.
Yeah. Andin isn't going to demand more money next time to appear.
So the last thing I want to talk about with actors and production stuff is apparently Al Pacino caused some problems throughout production demanding a bigger salary and rewrites and things like that. He also complained to Coppola because he has such a slow pace in shooting and rewriting and all of these things. He was notably told Coppola, he's like, "What are you doing? Serpico only took 19 days to shoot." And so basically he's just comparing all of his movies and saying like, it shouldn't take this long.
Wow.
But yeah, I mean, other than that, I feel like we've kind of given our general thoughts. Do you guys have anything else you want to say before we jump into more of the meat of it?
Let's get into it.
Okay, so we start with a scene in Sicily where we see young Vito with his mother walking during his father's funeral procession, and we get like text on screen that basically says their brother is like seeking revenge, kind of, and then he dies basically immediately. So we kind of get this tragic story of Vito, and then his eventual moving to America and immigrating and being put through that process, and then be kind of going through he had smallpox, I believe, so he had to go through some of that treatment and stuff like that. How did this strike you? Because I feel like this is a really powerful scene.
I am really struck by the fact that comparing book to movie, the backstory of Vito Corleone is like a small section of the novel, The Godfather. Yet it is expanded upon in such a compelling way in this film. It really, I think, humanizes Vito Corleone. Like seeing him as a kid and seeing what he went through and him escaping to America and being in that sort of just long line. He's 9 years old. And I mean, I have a 9-year-old. I can't imagine something like that happening to a kid that young. And, we know it does. We have stories of Syrian refugees in the news and stuff. We know kids go through these horrible things. But having a kid that age and then imagining Vito Corleone as a 9-year-old and going through all of this gives him this human element that makes everything that he accomplishes in the first Godfather movie seem all the more impressive. The beginning feels almost like a documentary. That scene where like they're walking in the funeral procession and it's pulled so far back, you just see the whole landscape, and then gunfire breaks out and everyone is running around. It has this, compared to like kind of how they could have played it with really close-in shots or quick cuts and so on. It has this really stark, almost documentary feel. The same thing when he's going through, the line in Ellis Island. It has this sort of this emotional distance to it that gives it that kind of documentary footage kind of feel to it.
I think the scene also really helps to set up Vito as, we have sympathy for him right away. We're pulling for him right away. And just his innocence, the innocence that we see of him when he all through all of this, he seems to have just like, he's being pushed one direction, pushed the other, and just going wherever he's told. And then at the end, he's like sitting in a chair, just singing to himself as any kid would, just kind of not really understanding what's going on and trying to keep themselves occupied.
Vito's story to me is a quintessentially American story. It's the immigrant story. It's sort of that rags to riches. It's the American dream, in a way, and maybe it's saying something about the American dream that in order to achieve it, he has to become a criminal. I don't know, but yeah, I think it's also with modern events, it struck a chord with me with a child immigrant coming in and what he was able to accomplish in America. I don't know. It's interesting because that is also undercut by him being a criminal. So, but I think one of the things that's so appealing about his story to the American point of view is that whole chasing the American dream and sort of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and all that, because he does that, and he creates an empire out of nothing. And that story, I think, is one that we all love, right? Like that's kind of been ingrained in us as Americans, I guess. I don't know. Am I reaching there? Are you guys picking up on any of that?
I agree, and I think that something else to note is just that he still had. I think you can kind of see his personality and see what kind of person he is, because of the fact that in these flashback scenes, we still see him as young and not even that young, but still innocent. He holds on to that innocence up until he's confronted with it and then makes the most of it. So it's kind of that same thing as Michael, like trying to stay away from it or just not wanting to be involved in it, just being happy with his family at first and then being pulled into this larger empire that, you know, eventually would force him to be, you know, keep his focus on other things rather than just his family, which we can tell from the beginning is all he really cares about.
He's also a remarkably calm and composed child, which kind of, you know, speaks to the sort of adult that he will become. Right? I mean, he sees his brother killed, his father killed, his mother killed, and he is alone in this new country. And he has this sort of composure, like this very almost eerily composed. When you think about the fact that he's this kid with nobody, I mean, he'd be, any other kid would be really freaking out. And I love the foreshadowing that goes on in that scene where his mother goes to Don Ciccio to beg for her son's life. And the Don is like basically refuses to show mercy and says when he grows up to be a man, he will seek revenge. And, you know, as a viewer, you know immediately like, yeah, that's going to happen. You're a dead man, Don Ciccio. And so that foreshadowing very early on in the film is great because you know it's going to pay off later on. That self-fulfilling prophecy. Don Ciccio can predict his own demise.
And that scene, I mean, that scene's crazy. We'll get to that. Let's move on here. So Michael and his family are celebrating the first communion of Michael's son. Basically, just like we're learning about how everything has gone since the end of Godfather Part 1. So we're learning about some stuff that's going on in Nevada. We're learning about things going on in Miami. But I feel like this scene is supposed to be reminiscent of that wedding scene. And how did that strike you guys? And I guess we'll take it all the way up until the assassination attempt, which to this day still I think is such a shocking moment with why are the curtains pulled.
Yeah, there's this fantastic contrast throughout the film between the wealth and decadence in Michael's timeline and the very, salt of the earth immigrant community that Vito is moving in. So you get these scenes of big parties and, Vegas and Cuba and dancers and singers and, clearly just lots of flowing wine. And so that atmosphere of wealth and excess on one hand with the just struggling to make ends meet and sort of that sepia tone of New York in Vito's time. And here's where you first see it is the scene with Anthony's communion. I was struck by the interaction between Michael and Senator Geary. So very much like Godfather Part 1, there's this big family event, all the Corleones are here, and it's ostensibly this big celebration, and yet this sort of deadly business is going on in the study behind closed doors. So that's very much a mirror of Vito and his petitioners in the first movie. Michael, likewise, his son's communion, and he's meeting with these political bigwigs. And there's always this friction between what is said publicly and what is said behind closed doors. So publicly, Senator Geary is all smiles and thank you to the Corleone family for this big contribution, yada, yada. And then he goes behind closed doors and is basically trying to muscle Michael and saying, I don't like you guineas coming to my state and you're going to pay for the license, but you're going to pay 10 times more. And Michael just very coldly saying, well, then you get nothing. So that secret antagonism behind kind of the surface of what's being said happens many places throughout this movie, including most notably between Michael and Hyman Roth. So there's always that what's being said versus, okay, what's really being meant. And that really comes across in Geary. But I like the line where Michael says, we're both part of the same hypocrisy. And that's also like a moral framing, right? If you think about Godfather Part 1 and how we see Vito as really a benefactor when the justice system has failed people. Here we see Michael basically, saying there's no difference really between me and this politician who you all respect as a law-abiding citizen. He's basically trying to muscle me just like any other gangster, and we're on equivalent moral footing here between the Corleones and the legal system, if you will.
Yeah, I like that. So something that popped out to me in this opening party is I think the difference between Michael and Vito and how they are a participant in these relative events. And to me, Vito showed humanity. He showed genuine. I just remember, what's the name of the singer? Fontaine?
Fontaine.
Yeah. When Fontaine shows up and he's so excited, and he came all the way from California, and he was taking pictures with his family. And to me, Vito seemed genuinely happy about his daughter getting married, and he was taking it very seriously. Michael is just like coldness throughout. He's sitting in the crowd and he's got this kind of blank look on his face. And I found myself going, does this man have any joy in his life at all? Because he doesn't seem to. He seems to be always, like, he's always on. He's always that gangster, and he's never something else. Whereas we see Vito, once again, playing with his grandkids and showing warmth. So maybe there's something to be said about Vito's ability to have kind of lead two lives, whereas Michael is unable to do that. He seems to be locked into one life, and because of that, he ends up destroying his family. And I just, I was thinking through the movie, and do we ever see him really smiling? Do we ever see him actually enjoying any part of this? He's got all this wealth, but he doesn't seem to enjoy it. It seems so empty.
So I agree completely. And here's something interesting. I was watching some of the deleted scenes at one point, and there's a scene that they filmed where Michael is giving his blessing for, I think it's one of his nieces, maybe it's Sonny's daughter or someone like that, to get married. And it's a moment of kind of humanity. It doesn't really affect the plot, and so it got cut. But one of the reasons they cut it was because apparently it shows Michael smiling too much. So it's obviously a very deliberate choice on the part of the filmmakers to portray Michael as this very cold, really inhuman character who really doesn't seem to have very many moments of humanity. There are a few, but you're right, he doesn't smile. Compared to, the fact that all of Vito's personal presence is based on his genuine warmth, his friendship, right? Everything that is an interaction with Vito is based on friendship and owing things to your friends. While as Michael seems very much more transactional and, more about maintaining power through that kind of like, through hard methods, if you will.
Michael, he doesn't realize what's important. Like it seems like he does, and he says that he does, like family is what's important, and he acts upon being honorable with the family and for the family, but he doesn't understand, like you were saying, it's not about the family. It's not about getting to the point where you can enjoy your life and enjoy your time with your family, because it is so limited. And I think there are points in the movie where the filmmakers use to kind of subvert expectations for us, because we're thinking, oh, maybe Michael's finally realizing family is what's important and leaning into certain things. And then come to find out he's just got cold, dead eyes, and he just does whatever needs to be done as far as he sees fit.
I mean, the one moment that stands out to me is like sort of the one joyful moment for him is when he gets that drawing from his son, and he's taking a moment to appreciate it, and that's right before the assassination attempt. So you can sort of see why he's not able to enjoy his life, because he can't escape the violence that he has surrounded himself with, right? And so it's almost like he can't allow himself to do that. Now, how Vito is able to do it, I don't know, other than the fact that he's just like, he's sort of the anti-hero that we want to love, and because of his ability to walk in both worlds, whereas Michael just doesn't seem able to do it as effectively, or at least as in a way that is going to be as fulfilling for him as a person.
We now flash to Vito in New York with his wife and son, and this scene where he loses his job because of the other Don, and the way that Vito takes it, and the way that he says it's okay, and he's like, "Don't worry about it. I'll find other work. You've always been good to me ever since I came here." Like that's why we root for Vito the whole time. He's just the coolest guy, nicest guy, even though he will, like you said, become this anti-hero. And then Clemenza shows up and invites him to take part in a burglary. What did you guys think about that scene?
This made me even sadder that Clemenza is not in the contemporary storyline, because he's in Vito's storyline, and he starts out being the character who you think is sort of the leader, right? He's like the one pulling the jobs, and he's gonna do a favor for Vito by basically stealing this rug. Like, they go into this house, he's like, "Oh, I've got this rug for you," and at some point, Vito coddles onto the fact that, oh wow, we're just stealing this rug from this house. This isn't Clemenza's friend after all. But Clemenza is kind of like this guy, with balls and some fire in his blood. And Vito, in comparison, seems very soft-spoken, very reserved, very just kind of a nice guy who's kind of holding down a regular job. Knowing the future of these characters and the fact that Vito will become the Don and Clemenza one of his capos, it just makes that character development more poignant. So again, I'm sad that Clemenza wasn't in the main storyline. But there's moments of humanity that Vito shows that I love. Like, there's this scene where he's just lost his job, and he comes home and he brings his wife a pear, and she's like, "Oh, a pear!" And they sit down and have dinner together. And so it's it's moments like that really even heighten that contrast, right? We never see anything remotely that tender between Michael and Kay.
Right. So we were talking about the differences between Michael and Vito, and I think here we see sort of the core things that make up Vito Corleone on display early, and that's he has a habit or an impulse to cultivate relationships wherever he can. You know what I mean? And if that takes him being a bigger person, or if that takes him suffering something but then turning it around into a moment where he can make a friend, like we see with him getting fired. And so to me, that shows that his reasons for getting into this is not about the wealth as much as it is about the relationships he's going to form, and the sort of like the capital he can build up in people's lives. And he wants to be important to them, and he wants to have that respect, I think, is so important to him. But respect genuinely earned, not respect out of fear. Because he never really intimidates. He doesn't do that. He lets his intimidation kind of all happen as far as his reputation and stuff, but he doesn't directly intimidate. And we see his interactions later where he doesn't do that. And conversely, Michael is much more about fear. It's much more about desperately holding on to power and wealth. And I think distancing himself and having as few relationships as possible, and only kind of keeping his inner circle. Whereas we see the Godfather, he's bringing in new people all the time to form new relationships, and he has this vast network of people who owe him favors. And I don't know, it seems like there's something at the core of Vito Corleone that works better in this world because of his ability to create meaningful relationships with people.
It's also a function of the scope and the time that they're working in, though. Because Vito is an immigrant in this Italian-American neighborhood in New York. And his power with having these relationships is kind of more organic, while as Michael inherits this empire that could fall apart and is working at a really high level involving government officials and business tycoons and trade deals and things like that. So it's you kind of get the sense that, like, that Michael is the person who had inherited the Roman Empire and now has to keep it from falling apart.
Right.
So in many ways, he can't emulate his father and is at a disadvantage there. And I think the personal cost to him is so much greater than it is to Vito.
And I think spreading out, as much as I think it was the right thing to do for their family and to keep them relevant and grow their empire, spreading out lends to not being able to have those more personable connections, and you have to start dealing with senators and all these people that eventually come his way, and those aren't people that are really, you know, in a position to do you favors or for you to do favors for them. They just ask, and like there's more deals and there's not favors anymore. And like you said, it's more calculated, more cold. So moving back to the more present timeline, Michael is going to basically find out who, well, I guess let's talk more about this assassination really quickly, jumping back a little bit. The assassination attempt that happens is so great, where she's like, why are the curtains open? And he realizes at the last second and they dive to the ground. But then afterwards, when they're like, Michael's commanding all the guys, he's like, find them alive. And then they find them dead. That's the first clue that clearly, no matter what, those people had to be dead because somebody in the family was to blame, or somebody close to them was to blame. And they were so scared that if they came back alive, that they would give them away. That I think the breadcrumbs that get set up for the ultimate payoff in this movie are very interesting, because it's different than in the first movie, where it's everything's building and building and building. This one starts with something and then it's like the investigation into that for the most part, and also spreading the empire a little further.
I generally find the storyline in the present day, Michael's storyline, is in many ways very convoluted compared to the very straightforward storyline of the rise of Vito Corleone. There's all these questions of who knew what, who ordered what, who double-crossed who. And it works on, I mean, there's multiple angles, and I've seen this movie multiple times, and I feel like I have a good handle on it. But I know the first time I watched this movie, I did not have an immediate handle on it all. In particular, because there are these lingering questions, and the assassination attempt is one of them. The drapes are open, and the assassins are found dead. So somebody went into Michael's bedroom and opened those drapes, and then killed those assassins. And in fact, the assassins are found by Fredo's wife. She's hysterical and says, they were right outside of my window, which makes, once you get the scene where Fredo gets the phone call, and you realize that he has been in contact with the family's enemies and is the traitor, it begs the question of, did Fredo do that? Did Fredo open the windows of his brother's bedroom and then kill these assassins, which is very... It's hard to believe, like knowing Fredo's character and how timid of a character he is, and how he just has never shown any sort of propensity for violence. And at the end, I know we're skipping all over the place now, but at the end, when he insists that he did not know it was a hit, that he was just in it because he thought there was a little bit for him, all those dots do not fully connect. And so, you know, there's multiple parts here where I like all the scheming, I like all the backroom dealing and the twists and turns, but there are definitely parts of this movie that result in these lingering questions, and where you're like, I'm not sure this all fits together. And Fredo's betrayal and the assassination attempt are one of them.
Well, in bringing back the Clemenza thing, like that would have given this really nice connection to everything, because instead we're introduced to all these new characters too, that we're having to learn who they are, how they fit into this world, how they relate to each other. Whereas we had Clemenza, who we remember from the first movie, and we knew how he fits into this family and all that. Like, that's really frustrating that didn't happen, because I think that would have been a stronger story, or at least one that would have been like easier to follow, like you said. Because I agree, at first time viewing, I was struggling with some of these new characters and figuring out who they were and remembering how they relate and all that. And it was sort of a process where I'm watching this very actively and taking notes, and but if you sit back and just try and just relax and watch this the first time, I could see it being very hard to follow.
Yes, especially because Michael says deceptive things to so many people. And, you know, he goes and has, after the assassination attempt, you know, he goes and talks to first he talks to Hyman Roth, and he tells Hyman Roth that Pentangeli ordered the hit, and he's going to take out Pentangeli. When if you think back on it, you realize, well, Pentangeli had just left Michael's compound that night. You know, he couldn't have ordered that hit, and he's the old school Sicilian. You know, he kind of plays the role of the person from Vito and Clemenza's generation, who kind of believes in those family ties and the personal connection, and he's there to petition Michael, and he's very disappointed that Michael puts this outside business interest above, you know, the personal ties. So Michael says these things to Roth. Then he goes to Pentangeli and tells Pentangeli that Roth ordered the hit. So he's saying different things to different people, which makes perfect sense because, you know, he is trying to deceive Roth. But as a first-time viewer, it would be confusing. You're like, okay, well, which does he really think it is? And who is it really? And you don't find out until later. And Roth also is being deceptive on another level, saying that Michael is going to be his successor and he's going to turn everything over to Michael, when later you find out that really he wants him dead. So because of these layers of deceptiveness, you really have to pay it. I think The Godfather Part 2 rewards repeated viewings.
I agree, yeah.
Because it does take some time to kind of unravel what's true and what's not.
I think the thing that like allows an audience member to understand and figure out what's going on is just basically Fredo. Because if Fredo wasn't involved, then it would have been so convoluted to try to figure out which of the two and all those things. But basically, once Michael speaks with Fredo, and Fredo says, like, I don't know either of those people. And then once we find that out and we hear him over to, like, at a party, or they were at a show and he was like speaking really loudly, and Michael hears that he was introduced to the show by, I think it was Roth. That's when we know, okay, well, Fredo, regardless of who actually called the hit, Fredo was involved. And
the New Year's Eve party, everyone is fleeing because the rebels. And in that moment when he confronts, that is such a poignant scene, one that like sticks in your mind. Yeah, the like, you know, you broke my heart, like that. Like, I mean, you see Michael really show emotion. I also love the scene when he realizes Fredo is the traitor, and it just lingers on his face for a moment, and that like the like realization that comes over his face is really powerful. So you're right. There's a lot of like kind of convoluted double crossing and like who said what, but coming back to that, there's just a sort of tragic betrayal of the brother is kind of what makes that plot really hit home.
The idea to set that scene in revolutionary Cuba where it's the new year and the government official basically says, like, I'm getting out of here. And then, everything's about to go down. And Michael says, you know, there's a plane that's coming for us. Don't freak out. But then at the same time says, you broke my heart. I knew you did it. Like, that is such a crazy scene. And then the chaos that ensues after that is just like the chaos that Fredo would be feeling. And it just like the fact that he runs away when Michael's like, come with me. You're still my brother. Still want to like get you out of Cuba. That's just like the idea to put all of that in Cuba with the revolution, because they had it, you know, set in that time period, was so cool. And to speak to the time periods also, the fact that everything's taking place in the early 1900s and the Vito stuff, they killed it. The production design of early 1900s, and the way that we're seeing cars come up, but people are still on like horses, and everything's dirt roads and the small shops. It just works so well, the overall setting of those two.
And once again, these are multiple periods within this movie, because this was filmed in the 70s, yet the contemporary quote-unquote part is like in 1958, I think they say early on. So that was in itself like a period, and then they had another period. So definitely very impressive. And the Cuba stuff, I agree, the way it plays off of the chaos and mimics it and is really cool. Fredo, it was interesting because Michael, in that moment where he has that passionate interaction with Fredo, it felt like a mistake to me, because we'd seen Michael be so calculating and wait to confront people for the right moment, and it just felt like the wrong moment for that. But maybe his emotion got the better of him. because he wasn't able to control the situation, and he wasn't able to control what Fredo would do. I was kind of shocked to see that out of him, I guess. I don't know. Why do you think I maybe just overcome with sort of anger at it? A little bit of that sunny temper comes out in him.
Yeah, I think it's because it's such a great point in the story to have it happen when everything is kind of falling apart. Like clearly the deal with Roth is falling apart. Cuba is being overrun by the revolutionaries. He sends his bodyguard to go take out Roth, but Roth has been admitted to the hospital and the bodyguard gets shot instead. So it's like the pillars are falling, like the stakes that Michael has put in the ground are kind of being cut down. And that moment when he confronts Fredo and Fredo runs, he tries to convince Fredo to come with him, and Fredo, instead of trusting his brother, is like, I'm out of here. Is kind of another indication that Michael is kind of losing control of the situation.
I also want to point out that is it Connie, the name of the sister?
Yeah.
If someone wanted to be able to betray Michael and never be suspected, it seems like it could be Connie, because it just seems like they have no respect for her. That she doesn't play any important. So like if it had been her all along, they would have never known because they never suspected her. It's amazing, and he treats her poorly to where, just like Fredo, she could be resentful of what's going on in this family and her role in it. I was almost kind of expecting, maybe there's something going on with Connie, but once again, not really.
No, because she's a woman, and the women don't have any real important role in this.
They just don't
trilogy.
Do anything.
No, really, no, because Connie's character is always struck me as very strange, because she goes through these roller coastery changes in her character arc. They're not really laid out in terms of how she gets from one to another. So she's hysterical and angry at Michael at the end of the first book. The end of the first movie. And then she makes an appearance near the beginning of the second movie where she's basically become this she's living it up and has all these multiple husbands and wants to get married to this dude that she's barely just met and Michael doesn't approve of. And she comes back, and now all of a sudden she wants to be back in the family, and she's like totally seems like she's bought in. And then going to Godfather Part 3, she becomes like a Lady Macbeth sort of character. So she's kind of being used somewhat conveniently throughout the story without any real kind of connection between these huge shifts in her storyline and why she's getting from one point to the other. Like, by the end, she's like, I want to come back and be close to home. Okay, well, all right. But, we don't. So Connie's a strange character who's not ever really
underutilized, it seems like, right?
Which made me think of, we read Jade City, and I was really happy to see a lot of the female characters be very important and play very important roles. And I felt like something that really badly that I wanted to see happen was to see Wen have a more and more important role. And then throughout the story, as she started to, I was like, yes, this is exactly what something like Connie, like a character like Connie should have had going on, like taken more agency and done more, position. Like if Connie had positioned herself to become important in the family somehow, like I just think that would be so great for her character. And it was awesome to see something like that in Jade City.
Well, if you like Wen now, just wait until book 2.
Ooh.
I just turned it in.
Uh-oh.
I'll just leave that there. Just throw that out there and walk away.
Awesome.
Yeah, I can't wait to read more. So, getting back to Godfather here, Vito and Carmela have 2 more sons, Fredo and Michael. And this is where Vito's starting to be extorted by Finucci. Basically, he realized that he was going to have to pay him money, so he was going to make an offer. And this was, the first offer that Vito gave that someone couldn't refuse. Basically, he offered him less money and tried to still play ball with this guy. And he said like, "Oh, you're funny." And then Vito was like, "Well, it's time to make sure I don't get extorted again." And then the parade happens, and he goes and kills his competition basically in order to make sure that his family and his friends are taken care of and they're not being extorted.
I love this rooftop stalking scene.
Oh, it's so good.
It's such a good scene. The contrast between, Finucci kind of making his way through the crowd. He's kind of like this jovial old guy in his like ostentatious cape. And
real quick, he grabs oranges.
Grabs an orange. Of course he does.
Were they leaning into it at this point? Because
I think they must have. They must have been like, I could totally see the temptation, because as a writer, when the fans start coming up with their theories, you're like, yeah, that is a good idea. I think I'm going to run with that. So I can, maybe they are at this point. They're like, oranges for everyone. So, so he's holding an orange. He's walking through the crowd, and Vito is stalking him on the rooftop. And it's such a great scene. And the way he handles Tessio and Clemenza in that dinner scene is also really great, where they're like, well, how, he's like, well, I take $50 and I'll sort it out. And they're like, why are you going to do that? And he's like, just trust me. So I find that like Vito's scenes create almost, yes, there's murder and stuff going on, but they almost create a sense of levity compared to Michael's storyline, and tonally as well, comparing sort of everything in Vito's storyline seems to be a little softer, a little more sepia toned, closer quarters, and so many of Michael's scenes are more stark, right? You've kind of got that like the Prince of Darkness cinematography going on with a lot of Michael's scenes. Yeah, the way that he kills Finucci is almost it seems almost casual. The way that like he plays with the light, and Finucci taps the light and is like, what's going on? And then Finucci is really shocked. He's like, he can't believe that this is happening.
I think the part that I love about this also is that using this kind of prequel flashback type thing to your advantage as a filmmaker, like you're saying, there's a bit of levity there. We're not worried for Vito. We know that he's going to pull this off because we know where the story goes. So I think it's fun to do that and to use that scenario as a way to make the audience kind of just see it, like you said, as more of just like this like fun tale that's happened, and like the old like war stories, or like recounting something that happened. It's cool to see, Vito standing there in the dark with the gun wrapped in like a towel or whatever that was, and just knowing that he's going to succeed here and that he's going to go on to become this huge influence, and this is kind of his first big move.
Then he breaks the gun apart. He comes down the stairs and he joins his family at the parade. Yeah. And he's bouncing Michael in his lap and saying like, oh, Daddy loves you. He murdered Finucci, and now he's joins the family, and
he's able to keep those lives separate, right?
And I love that he's right there. He's like, I love you, Michael. Daddy loves you, kind of thing. And then it flashes, again, a great transition. We flash to Michael and what Michael's up to. So
I just want to point out real quick. I kept thinking about Vito as having a similar story to the superhero stories that we're getting so much of now. But to me, he's a super anti-hero, which I think is kind of fun. But yeah, jumping from rooftop to rooftop, much like you said, like how we know he's going to succeed. It's the same, because like when you see a superhero movie, like Spider-Man's going to be fine, like you know what I mean, like whatever it is. So it's interesting how that can be this like sort of dark hero, but also be sort of a familiar story.
I don't know, man. Did you see Infinity War? I'm just kidding. But yeah, no, I agree with you. It is. I like that. So
when we return to Michael's storyline, there's this growing sense of dismay in that all these, I just keep getting the sense that, these things shouldn't be happening. Like, oh, Fredo shouldn't be a traitor. Like, why is Michael having to testify in front of like a Senate Judiciary Committee? Like, oh, like all these things are just, there's this kind of growing dread, and, Kay loses the baby, and it turns out that it wasn't a loss, it was an abortion. And so all these sort of things are starting to fall apart for him. And I think it's encapsulated in that one moment when he has his conversation with his mom, who did not speak at all in the first movie, to my recollection. She has a few speaking lines finally in the second, but he has his conversation with his mom where he basically says, Dad was being strong for the family, but could you lose the family? She basically says, how can you lose your family? Right? Which is which is sort of like the theme of the movie tied up in one scene, if you will, right? That like, that Vito built this family and Michael is losing it. And that all those scenes after the revolution in Cuba have this kind of bittersweetness to them because Michael still triumphs from a tactical perspective. So he gets out of being prosecuted because he has Pentangeli's brother flown in and in the room with him, during the hearing, and that shuts Pentangeli up really quickly. He basically shuts Kay out and keeps his kids. He gets Fredo. And so he's still kind of triumphing on a tactical level, but there is this sort of this sense of just despair that starts pervading the storyline.
It's a Pyrrhic victory, right? Like it's at such cost that it is almost no longer worth it.
And it feels to me that like Michael's gotten himself in a situation where like he's doing all the right things for the business and for the family, and yet he's just losing all over the place. He's losing his family. He's in more ways than one. He's losing his brother. He's losing his wife. His kids are potentially going to be taken away from him if Kay could do that. And then also we find out that the miscarriage was an abortion, which is him completely losing family in a way that could have been prevented in his eyes, because he sees it as like this thing where she says like she didn't want to bring another one of his kids into the world.
And that leads to one of the most, I don't know what's the word, like intense, just like powerful slaps in cinematic history, in my opinion. Like I couldn't believe it. That slap was something, and I think it's because Pacino moves so far to do it, and he knocks over a chair on his way. But something about that moment, it happens so fast. It's just one slap, and it's him losing his temper, because we never see him strike Kay other than this moment.
He's so composed in every other situation that scene where he finally just is enraged has a lot of power.
Yeah.
So there's two more flashback scenes that I want to knock out together real quick. The scene where Vito's approached by a widow who's going to be evicted, and the way that he really does, we see his status in this moment, and he basically gives the guy the money, and then he comes back after realizing who Vito was and gave the money back. I love that scene because it's like that's the beginning of Vito having the status that he does, and then with that status, the other scene that happens is he goes to Sicily to go to the Don who wronged his family, and he gets the revenge on them that he's has been building his entire life, I'm sure, but finally has the power to act on it. And so he gets into the compound and he goes up and he just says like, "This is who I am," and he can't hear him at first, so he gets closer, and it's that very, very close quarters murder, and he just cuts him up with a knife and runs away, which I mean it's just the payoff.
It's such a great scene.
Yeah, it's so good.
The widow scene is like my favorite little mini story from Vito's past, and it was in the book as well, and I was so happy to see it make its way into this movie. And it is what Fonda was saying. It's so light. Like we literally see this comedy of this character who comes in and he can't get the door. Like he can't get the door on the way in and out, and it feels like a different movie almost. Like it's so funny, and the way they all Vito shares a little laugh with Clemenza, and it's such a lighthearted moment, and it is the contrast between that and the darkness that's going on in the other plot line is pretty stark.
And everything that Vito does is very personal, right? If you think of the murders that he pulls off, Finucci and then Don Ciccio at the end, he gets in close. He has to like see them face to face. And you contrast that with Michael and the orders that he gives, which are cold-blooded and are carried out by assassins at a distance. And that creates yet, this other contrast between them. There is a scene once we are done with Vito's storyline, and I think the last scene we get in Vito's storyline is he's telling Michael, wave goodbye, Michael. And then you go back to Michael's storyline. There's a couple of just really heartbreaking scenes near the end of this movie. One of them is a small scene between Michael and Tom. And Michael basically asks Tom if he's going to leave. Like he finds out that Tom has had this job offer. Tom is like, well, I didn't tell you about it because I turned it down. And Michael, very sort of passive aggressively, is like, are you with me? Because if not, you can take your wife and kids and your mistress and you can get out of here. And in that moment, and Tom says, why do you hurt me, Michael? I've always been loyal to you. And there's that brotherly interaction in that one small scene, I think, is really powerful because Tom really is just the most loyal guy. He's just this steadfast, reliable brother. And Michael has lost so much. He's lost his father. He's lost Sonny. He's lost his first wife. He's lost Kay. He's lost Fredo. And Tom is kind of like one of the last things he can depend on. And in that moment, he seems cold with Tom, but you can feel underneath that there's this paranoia that he has, that he's losing. Like, am I going to lose Tom as well? And they speak, and he asks in Italian. He says, so you're staying then? Like, he reverts to their childhood language, like asks, are you going to stay? And I felt like that scene really it's a moment of vulnerability for Michael that you don't see, elsewhere. And he, compared with how cold he is to Fredo after he finds out that Fredo has betrayed him. So I love that interaction. And again, like, I think Robert Duvall just like knocks it out of the park throughout.
It made me wonder if Michael, it was truly sincere when he tells Tom that he's his brother and that he loves him like a brother, because I don't know if it's true, because I feel like in this moment, this sort of betrays that he doesn't quite view him as true family. Because if he did, he maybe wouldn't suspect him here. But the converse of that is that his true family has betrayed him now. So like you said, that paranoia is there too. So I like that it's almost unanswerable. Like, what's true? Does he really view him or not? Like, I don't, or is it just caused by Fredo's betrayal? I don't know. I do love that everybody's sitting around discussing how they're going to kill all these people and they're all eating oranges. So that comes back.
So to kind of tie up the Michael storyline here, Carmela Corleone dies and they go to the funeral. And at the funeral, Michael appears to forgive Fredo. And what did you guys make of that, actually, real quick? Well, Luke, because it's the first time you saw it, did you think that he was forgiving him and realizing that it was time for family to prevail?
I did at first, but before the scene was like even done, I immediately went, wait a minute. We've seen this from him before, right, in the first movie. So, yeah, I immediately thought, he actually hasn't forgiven him.
Also, when he looks up and he looks at Al Neri.
Yes, that tips it. But, like, I feel like I was onto it before that moment, like, but then when I saw that, I'm like, yep, okay, never mind. He hasn't really forgiven him. This is going to be very similar to the first movie, which was sad because I was sad for him. And then Fredo, I think there's a scene in here that we maybe hopped over where he has a confrontation with Michael in which Michael confronts him and he reveals sort of like how he's been so frustrated with his role in the family and he's kind of flailing about. And I just wanted to point out cinematically or from the cinematography or how striking this scene was and how much I loved it, because the way it was framed against this sort of like really beautiful snowy scene outside, but then and then I kept thinking, oh, maybe it'd be warmer inside, but no, it's cold inside too, because we see Michael's breath frosting, which was interesting. And then Fredo is laid back in this chair and he's sort of at the mercy of Michael there, and so because of that he seemed very childlike and he seemed very petulant in a way too, because he's kind of flailing about and proclaiming how he's so smart, even though I'm not stupid, I'm smart, and all this stuff. And I felt so sorry for him too, and I think visually they were doing a lot to make that scene play a certain way, and I just like it struck me as just really good filmmaking.
And I think he also talks about how he's like, I'm your older brother. How did this all happen?
Yeah,
so it's like clearly they were saying like the older brother, it doesn't matter that he's the older brother at this point, but he felt like he was entitled to some stuff, and he says like he wishes he was more like dad.
Yeah, Fredo is such a tragic character. Connie even says to Michael, he's like, Fredo is so sweet and helpless without you. And it's just...
But is he? Or did he kill 2 hitmen?
Yeah, I mean, getting back to this thing of, like, not all the breadcrumbs connect very well. What exactly did he know? I mean, in that confrontation scene, he insists he did not know it was a hit. Well, if he didn't know if it was a hit, then who the heck opened the window and killed those 2 guys? So clearly some lingering questions as to what exactly Fredo's role was. And who knows, maybe they're in Michael's mind, and that's why he decides, regardless of what Fredo assures him of, he can't trust his brother anymore. And, there has to be the ultimate punishment for it. But the way they set it up, again, it's very stark and cold, because you see Fredo with Anthony and sort of trying to get back to a normal life and bonding with his nephew, going out in the boat on the lake, and Michael just watching from a distance.
Yeah, it's really something. There's 2 lines that are hopping out at me that I'm realizing we haven't mentioned that I think are both very important to the story. One is keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. And when I heard that, I was like, that old cliche. And then I went, wait a minute. And so I looked it up, and like, sure enough, it wasn't a cliche because it was popularized by this movie. Now, they didn't necessarily invent it. It was something from before, but it wasn't a thing until this movie, and Michael says it. And of course, it's so important to the story, right? Like, we see him do this constantly. And then the other one is the realization that if I think, I can't remember exactly how the line goes, like, if we haven't learned anything, it's that we can kill anyone. And that also goes back to me to that is something that Vito learned, I think, early on, right? Like, that's his first lesson, was learning that anyone can be killed, no matter how powerful. And that's something he's sort of passed on, and I think is also at the heart of this story.
And I think that's the offer that no one can refuse, right? Like, if somebody's like, you're going to die, or you're going to do this, that's the offer that no one can refuse.
That's the implied threat, yeah.
Yeah, so many lines from the Godfather movies that have just become cultural idioms, like shorthand that everyone understands now.
Yeah.
The like, anyone could be killed, that shows up in Game of Thrones. I remember distinctly a scene where Arya Stark says anyone can be killed, and had a Godfather moment there.
There's a lot of Godfather in Game of Thrones too.
Yeah. So Roth is refused asylum and denied entry to Israel. He's forced to return to the United States. Over the descent of Tom Hagen, Michael sends Capo Rocco Campone to intercept and shoot Roth on arrival. Rocco is shot dead by federal agents after completing his mission. At the witness protection compound, Hagen reminds Pentangeli that failed plotters against the Roman emperor often committed suicide, and assures him that his family will be cared for. He later slits his wrists in the bathtub.
Brilliant scene. Wow.
Again, I just love Tom. Tom is like my favorite character, or at least one of my favorite characters, because he just does what needs to be done. There's this scene earlier where Michael comes home after escaping Cuba and is like, did you get my son a Christmas present? And like, Tom is like, he's doing all this. He's also somehow, meanwhile, doing like Michael's Christmas shopping for him. Like, so Tom is he's just, everyone needs a Tom Hagen in their life, I swear.
Yeah.
But there's a great scene moment when he has this confrontation with Pentangeli, and Pentangeli says, Pentangeli is reminiscing about the good old days. And he says, the Corleone family, we was like the Roman Empire. And Tom says, we were once.
Yeah, I love that.
There's that line kind of brings it around full circle of like, now we've seen kind of the rise of the empire, and now we're past the peak. And that like we were once is sort of where we leave the story, really. Everybody
knows that the Roman Empire eventually falls, right? Like, that's kind of baked into that comparison. Yeah. So as one of the things that when I'm watching movies like this or reading stories like this, I'm always on the lookout for things I can learn from for my own writing. And this scene stood out to me as an example of something I want to get better at. And that's having characters talk about something without like saying the thing they're actually talking about. And I love that in this scene, how they're talking about how he can make this up to Michael and how he can ensure that his family will be okay. And the way they talk about it all is as this story of, oh, this is what people used to do in the Roman Empire, and it's all subtext. And I don't know, I just love that, and it's something that I think I want to pay attention to because I think it's very cleverly done.
Agreed. Pentangeli is also a tragic character. He's this old school, he's part of the old guard, and he really gets short shift in this film because he gets denied by Michael. He gets almost killed in a way, in a ploy to frame Michael for it. He gets used by the FBI. He gets used by Roth. He has to commit suicide. I mean, he really goes through some crap in this film, and I feel sorry for him because he's kind of like that link, and it would have been even more powerful if it really had been Peter Clemenza. But he's that link to Vito's generation.
Yeah, does he ever know that he made a mistake too? Because he thinks that Michael turned on him, but it was actually Roth, right? And so I can't remember. In his conversation with Tom, do we get the impression that he knows that he's made a mistake? Or does he always think that Michael had turned on him?
I think it's unclear, but the tenor of the conversation that he has with Tom makes me think that he realizes he's been used.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's supported.
And that's why he falls on the sword.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The last thing is just the kind of mid flashback where Michael says he's going into the army.
The final scene that we get in this film, well, first of all, the closing scene of Michael is just him and his 1,000-mile stare, contemplating like all that has befallen him, and that's such a Michael Corleone thing, right? That cold, long stare.
Yeah.
The closing scene of this movie, I think, is one of the most heartbreaking endings in all of cinema history because it shows the Corleone family at its peak, at really their most powerful and happy. Vito is the patriarch of the family. He has all his grown children there. We see Carlo being introduced. Sonny and Fredo are kind of, play punching each other, and Tom's there. And there's just this sense of kind of closeness of family at the dinner table. And Vito does not show up, obviously. Like they're waiting for him to arrive because it's his birthday. And when Michael says he's enlisted and Sonny gets mad at him, it's Fredo who defends him and congratulates him. And just everything about this scene has such a sense of terrible, bittersweet nostalgia. And it's a really effective way to bring the movie to a close because we've got the two storylines and they're kind of going in parallel. One is rising, one is falling, and we kind of end by bringing them together in a way that resonates into both storylines.
Yeah, I love that, and you underlined the tragedy of Fredo and him being sweet in this moment, like was pointed out. And then the one thing I remember noting is I was like, oh, I wonder if they're going to get Marlon Brando to make a cameo, and are we going to see Vito one last time? But after having that kind of wish, just like because I wanted to see the character, I thought about it later, and I realized that the scene works better with him being off screen and being absent, because it highlights Michael's loneliness. And if you end on a moment where they're kind of together and we see them happy together, that's a very different tonal ending than him sitting alone at the table and being apart from it all.
Yeah.
And those two plot lines, although they intersect, it also further shows that like Vito is no longer there, and Michael can't rely on him. He's gone, and he is alone now. So yeah, like that mirrors perfectly with what happens at the end, which I thought was very tragic in itself. Like I said, a Pyrrhic victory. We've seen him. He's done the same thing he did in the first movie, right? It's very similar in a lot of ways. He's pulled off all these multiple murders, and everything's come together, and all of his enemies are defeated. But this time, it's too much for him. It seems like to me, and it seems like he's lost everything, and ultimately, like I said at the beginning, why is Michael doing this at a certain point? It's like almost just going through the motions, because what is he getting out of it other than just preserving his wealth? Because he's destroying everything else.
And I think that's what he realizes in that moment too. And I think we kind of get flashes of a couple seconds of footage of like young Vito, that he's kind of like thinking about the past and thinking about himself, and ending with, you know, Michael going into the service is also, it's that moment where they're all together, and then Michael's the one who's it's gonna be bad news to Vito, and you know, Vito doesn't want this to happen, so it's like everything's finally come together, and then it's like Michael is like this kind of like beginning of this cycle where he wants to get away, he wants to do his own thing, and then he's forced to come back, and like he's in this situation that he didn't want to be in the first place, and maybe he's thinking about how it would have gone had he just let the family fall or something like that, instead of taking over for Vito.
Well, I think this is a good place to leave this film. I think this has been a joy to cover. So I want to talk to Fonda about Jade City, and I want to specifically bring up a question that might get into some spoilers. But just in case people don't want to have the book spoiled, which I totally understand, and you're gonna check out now, we'll do a little kind of like ending here, and then we'll have an extra bit after a spoiler warning. Does that sound good to you, Fonda?
Sounds good.
Okay, so we do want to thank you guys for listening to us cover the Godfather. It's been an epic journey. We are so happy to have Fonda along for our trilogy of episodes.
Thank you for giving me the excuse to binge the book and the trilogy again. Not that I really needed an excuse, but it's a good one.
I mean, and you clearly, like, this is something you know well, and has been important to you, and that has shown, and we've just loved having you along to kind of almost guide us through this. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you. It's been such an honor. It's been so much fun.
So if people want to find you online and check out your books and all of that, where can they do that?
They can find me on my website, which is fondalee.com, or on Twitter, I'm Fonda J. Lee. And my books are sold in all the usual places, bookstores and Amazon and so on.
Yeah, and shout out to the Audible book version, which I went between because I have a physical copy, but I also like to listen to audiobooks. So I was doing both. And I thought it was very good. Like I really liked the narrator. I thought he did a great job. So yeah, if you wanted to get that book for free, you can actually use, audibletrial.com/ink to film, and you can get a free credit. Use it on Jade City.
Oh, awesome. Cool. I'm glad you liked the audiobook. I thought the narrator did a really good job, and I'm glad to hear that you guys thought so too.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to get into some spoilers now. So, feel free to check out. Do come back. We're going to do, we want to announce we're going to do Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets is going to be our Christmas episode, which I know is kind of like loosely Christmassy, but we talked about in Philosopher's Stone that it had sort of a Christmas feel to it. So anyway, enough of a reason. We put it up for vote, and our listeners voted on that one. So come back for that. But otherwise, go ahead and check out, and then we're going to get into some spoilers for Jade City. All right, spoiler warning over. James, do you want to lead off with anything, or do you just want me to get into my thing?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, I love that Gwen is basically like this character who we meet, and she's kind of I don't remember the character's name in The Godfather. That's kind of the similar role, but it's like Sonny's wife or the person that she's talking to,
right,
basically.
Lucy Mancini, like that first big sex scene in The Godfather.
Yeah. So like I kind of was getting that, and I was like, wow, is it gonna be really similar to that? And then as we go, I just loved her relationship with Shay as that went on. I was like, this is so perfect. This is exactly what I wanted. So I wanted to ask you, like, in terms of what I read, I think that Shay could potentially, and this is, you don't have to answer if it's getting too much into other stuff, but it feels like Shay could potentially in the future be in a position to take on even more of a leadership role, and then she's almost like her own leader in a way, and then Juan is kind of trying to position herself to be almost like a hand. So
interesting. You predicting?
I don't want to predict as much as I want to say, like, what inspired like those two characters to come together, if anything, or if it was just something that you felt like would work really well within this story.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to, like I said, create a cast of characters that would have a lot of really interesting and compelling family relationships. And Shay obviously is a major character in the story. And I wanted, from the start, I wanted to make sure that that the female characters had their own agenda, and their own storylines, right? It's the story takes place in a very patriarchal society. It is, like The Godfather, got a lot of like these macho elements to it, and I don't like stories in which that's sort of an excuse to then not have female characters or have
Right.
female characters who are victims and absent.
Yeah.
Because
women still exist in
I
that
mean,
world.
Clearly there have been so many societies and time periods in history filled with sexism and patriarchy, and women still playing extremely important roles within that context. And so that was one of my thoughts going in, was that, in addition to the fact that Shay is this daughter of the ruling Greenbone family and has had this life experience of leaving and coming back, she's also a woman who faces the challenges of being a Greenbone in this very sort of warrior caste society. And Wen has even a layer on top of that, because she's a Stone Eye, and that's seen as an unlucky distinction in their world, and has every reason to be sort of the protected mob wife that we've seen in so many other storylines. And I wanted to subvert that. So it made sense for these characters to have some interesting interactions, and I very much thought about, well, how would each of the characters relate to each of the other characters? Because one of the things that makes really well-rounded characters, in my mind, is the way they're different with different people. Right? We don't interact with our parents the same way we interact with our siblings or our children, and that's very much the case in real life. And the more you can make that happen in fiction, the richer those characters will be. So, I wanted to have Shay have a different relationship with her brother Hilo than she has with Wen, than she has with her brother Lon. So all of those just played. I tried to find opportunities for them to have these sort of rich and complicated relationships.
And I have to say that Shay is my favorite character, and I think you've kind of talked about it in the podcast, but her kind of prodigal son journey, and then her becoming the new weatherman, is just it was just very, like, it was very Michael, but it was her own thing. And I love that she like you said, that she kind of, when she first meets Wen, she sees her as like, oh, she she's just this Hilo's lover, and she doesn't really have much importance within the context of the story. So that's why I felt you kind of like subverting that by being like, yeah, it's that character, but then ultimately it's really not, because she wants to be involved more. And then we see her start to scheme with Shay. So I just loved all of that.
Agreed. So all right, so I'm going to lay out my sort of, I guess it's kind of like a theory. It's also just an observation, and we can maybe get you to react to it. But so I was thinking about the role of Jade in the story, and I love that it plays multiple roles. For one, it empowers people to commit violence and to become so larger than life within their society. It's a commodity that is being fought over, that is being traded, that is being sought. And it is also like a drug, and that people get addicted to it. And it has this really negative effect on people's lives. And then we see, what is it? The Shine is the other drug, or am I getting that wrong?
Yep, Shine's the drug.
And that enables you to bring on more Jade, right? And so when I started thinking about it that way, I also connected it to as sort of like a metaphor for the greed and the avarice, and it also makes sense that it's green, and that it's something that everybody wants, but then it also is so damaging. And then you look at Lon, and how he dies, is being tied up into sort of his addiction that he's created, and trying to bring on more Jade than he can, and having to use the Shine. And I don't know, I just wanted to get your reaction to that. Did you because you clearly set it up to be like almost a drug type presence, and how it affects the characters in a negative way. Do you feel like you were trying to say something grander about sort of greed and sort of that lust for power?
Yes.
Okay.
To all of that. So I wish all readers were as insightful as you just kind of laid it all out. And
okay, I'm glad I hit on something.
You
this
totally
is the first
did.
time where I was able to say that and have the person there to be like, yes.
Right. Because normally
I
you
say
have
that.
all these theories and you're talking about it, but like, the filmmaker's not there to say yes. But yes to all of that. That was very deliberate on my part. That I wanted to use this trope of the magic substance that we find in fantasy so many times, and I wanted to play with it and use it as a metaphor for greed and power. There's so much, if you think about epic fantasy, right? There's always like magic crystals or magic swords. Like that's nothing new. There's always like these magic substances, oftentimes it's,
magic rings,
gems, infinity rings, right? So there's so much of that in fantasy. And I wanted to use that idea of the magic substance, and Jade obviously, fitting into the cultural context of this world as a way to just heighten all of the human drama around power. And that's why it has, sort of these different roles in the story of both being a way to have really cool action sequences, and also a way to have like the international trade and politics play out in this storyline, and also be the personal downfall for some of these characters, as well as a source of strength, right? So there's that too much of anything becoming a liability. That clearly applies to Jade, and it's also a way to subvert that trope of kind of the blood talent, right? A lot of fantasy fiction, there's like some characters that are kind of born with a special ability, or they're the chosen ones because they're magicians, like Harry Potter, which you've covered. You're born a wizard, and so hooray! At age 10, you get this letter and you get to go to the special school. Well, in my world, yes, you have, there's certain people who are born with this greater ability to harness Jade, but now there's these advances in technology, and that's all changing. So it was a way to also play with like change and modernization and globalization. So I often do, and Jade City, the trilogy, is a low magic world. And I come from, before I wrote this trilogy, I wrote science fiction. And so I treat the magic almost in a science fictional way. It's the only real magic element in this world. And I like to change, I like it to be that. I like it to just be, the world is very recognizable, except there's this magic substance, and that makes everything different. And so that's what I was trying to do there.
Yeah, it works so well. And I love that the tolerance in the people it sort of makes sense scientifically too. Like you build up tolerance to drugs or tolerance to alcohol the more you drink, and so the idea that they are special only because they've been around it longer, it seems like, and they've built up this sort of like genetic tolerance for it. So they're not chosen,
right?
They just happened to be that way,
right? Yeah. And I also dislike the fantasy cliche of you're just kind of have this magic ability. I prefer it when like you have to really work hard at it. And that kind of plays into the whole idea of like, these martial arts schools and all the training they have to go to be able to like harness the magic. So really Jade City was a way for me to like take all these things that I liked from different genres and elements and like try and create something new out of them.
Yeah. I have to say, you talked about the fight scenes. I really enjoyed the fight scenes. And specifically, I love what you did with Lon's fight scene, where he's coming out and he hasn't fought in a while and he hasn't needed to show up in this way before. So there's like that vulnerability, and he's unsure of it, so we're unsure of it. And seeing Jade used kind of like that, I thought that was awesome. And the way that, the other thing that I really, really loved was the way that Andon nearing the end, he declines his jade. I thought that was so powerful and so cool that he's realized what a detriment it could be, and kind of go. I'm so excited to see what happens with this character next, because it's like, will he be able to stay away from it forever? Is he still going to be able to be effective within the family without it?
I would think no, but we'll see.
Oh, just wait. I'm cackling to myself because I'm like in line edits right now, and like the book is turned in or will be turned in very soon. So I'm biting my tongue because it's so tempting to tell you guys stuff, but I'm not going to.
That moment where Andon turns it down was, I think, the thing that solidified my like whole theory about it, and my whole because it was his rejection of it at the end that highlighted that, like, we're not supposed to just feel like Jade is this perfect thing that we should all want. Whereas if he had taken it at the end, we might have been like, oh, cheering for him. Yeah, he took the jade. Right. Whereas instead him rejecting it goes like, wait. Think about the consequences of this. And then I also just wanted to point out that Lon was my favorite character. And so, of course, which always seems to happen whenever I read, like, that's the one who dies. And I think I really empathize with his position as someone who isn't necessarily the best fighter, but feels like he has to put on airs and is worried about maintaining control, and just, I don't know, he was so well-rounded, and so he was so responsible, and I think it makes obvious that he needs to die because he creates this big power vacuum. Just really cool, and I really liked that character.
I love the what you did with the wartime pillar thing. Instead of the wartime weatherman, it's like the wartime pillar. Yeah. He can't be a wartime pillar, so he had to go, and like I love that. I thought that was so fun.
That's why I was comparing him to Tom. I think I said in last episode, he kind of reminded me of Tom a little bit, like Tom and Michael, and like multiple characters. Yeah. But in that sense too, right? Like he felt like he had to prove himself.
Mm-hmm. One last thing that I wanted to say, I wanted to point out at least, is the sleeping with the fishes became very prominent and became like a cultural touchstone thing from The Godfather. And feeding the worms feels like that send up that you've placed in your novel, and I loved it. Like every time somebody was like, they're going to be feeding the worms, I was like, yes, I loved it.
Was it coming down from the forest? Is another one?
Right.
That's also great.
Yeah, that's the fun part of being a fantasy writer in particular is doing the world building and coming up with kind of like the idioms, the cuss words, the cool names. I had a lot of fun coming up with the names of all the characters' cars.
Yeah.
And like the restaurants and stuff like that. That's always like candy for me when I'm writing.
I just want to say it was such a visual story in the sense that like how these fight scenes played out, and clearly your martial arts background plays a huge role in that, and you're able to block out these fights in a convincing way. And but then you also have like magic going on too, right? So it's not just like a conventional hand-to-hand fight. And like whipping the knife, like bullets and knives around you, and using it almost like you're slingshotting around a sun or something. Like I love that, and it was kind of rooted in science. And anyway, it's so visual that I think I've said it all 3 episodes, but I really want to see an adaptation of this. So
and then you guys could do a podcast on it. That would be cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's why I'd love to.
Yeah.
Selfishly speaking, right?
The other thing that you were talking about, the world building that you've done, and I loved a lot of the older story that we got piecemealed out. Like we would learn, and the interludes. I especially love like those kind of moments for us to get like insight into like their lore and like what they believe, their beliefs are, what their like ancient stories are. And then even that, like, 2 generations ago, I believe it is, where there's like the wars that go on and everything. I thought that the world that was built around these characters was so fully realized as well. So I really love that.
Yeah, and I keep going because I'm so in this podcast now. I'm like, how would a filmmaker design this? How would this look? And what would be the aesthetic of Jade City, the adaptation, and those are all really interesting questions that I really hope we can get into at some point, because if this is adapted, we will definitely cover it. I'd say that right now.
Well, if you guys know any Hollywood folks who are interested, send them my way.
Will do.
Well, maybe somebody listening to this will. Yeah, do it. But yeah, thank you so much, Fonda. This has been truly a fun experience, and an epic one, going through the trilogy of episodes on The Godfather, and it's just been really cool.
It has been really cool. Thanks, guys. It's been a lot of fun.
All right, we just want to thank patron Andrew M. Thank you for supporting us, and this podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of our patrons. If you'd like to figure out how to become one yourself and what we're offering, go to patreon.com/ink2film.
And if you want to connect with the podcast, we're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at Ink to Film. And on Facebook, we have a group called the Council of Inklings where we interact and people vote on our projects sometimes. And we post about ink and film related things that are going on in the industry.
You're going to run that joke into the ground, man.
I'm going to make it so that everybody doesn't want to hear about ink or film anymore.
Yeah, we just posted a poll about our holiday special, and Scrooge was like doing really, really well. Scrooged almost, on the power of Bill Murray alone, perhaps. But no, it lost out to Harry Potter. So we will be returning to the Wizarding World for our Christmas episodes, which I know you got to be excited about, James.
Oh my God, I'm so excited to do. It was so hard for me to not read Chamber of Secrets as soon as we finished Sorcerer's Stone like a month ago.
All right, we'll be right back into it. So we hope you join us for that. And I know it's not really a Christmas movie, but hopefully it's close enough. There's a Christmas scene, right?
So if you wanted to send any feedback to the podcast, we're inktofilm@gmail.com.
Yeah, you can send any sort of questions you might have or anything you want to talk about in regards to Harry Potter. Or we have our Last Looks episode coming up later at the end of December, and we'd love to get some more questions for that. Anything we want us to do, like if you wanted to ask us to reflect back on anything from this year, that would be awesome. So definitely send those in.
The other way you could help out the podcast is leaving a rating or review on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. We recently hit 50, which was
51
awesome.
now, I think, actually.
And so 51.
We're
now we're on our way to
right
100.
Yeah.
So
well on our way. Yeah, that would be awesome.
Also, thank you to Universal Beats and AJ Pro for the use of our intro and outro music.
Yeah, and thank you again to Fonda for coming on. It was so cool to have her here and read Jade City. This was a really unique project because of that, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was fun to get like that. We got so many different perspectives on this now because we watched the movies and read the books and then read her book, and it was just such a cool way to experience her book as well.
All right, until next time.
Thanks for listening.